In today's video, I'll be talking about dots and pivoting dots, manipulating dots. I'll show the end results at the end of the video. To get started, I first copied my master pattern. I do that to prevent wear and tear, and so I use a copy of it instead. So I outline the pattern pieces, and then for the inner lines, I use a tracing wheel to copy all my lines. I am using a pen to copy my pattern because it is a fine tool and my pattern piece already has the outline of the marker, which is about a 16th of an inch probably. So when it comes to copying your pattern this way, you do have to be careful to not add extra measurements to your pattern by cutting out the outlines, and that helps you avoid adding extra measurements. So once my pattern pieces are copied, I cut them out, and then I'm ready to start doing my first dot pivoting, which will be moving half of my waist dot to my shoulder. So I'm adding a shoulder dot to this pattern. So I trace around the center front and to my first dot leg at the waist, and then I am moving to the shoulder where I am going to mark where I want to put my shoulder dot, which will be at about halfway of the shoulder line. Or I should really say the midpoint of my shoulder line. And so I pivot it around because I'm doing half of my dot, adding half of my dot. So I close it halfway through and then I mark that on the shoulder line. Once I close it, the shoulder tilt, and that's what I use to help me figure out where to put my leg dot on my shoulder. And then I just go around and finish tracing my pattern piece, and that's how I did my shoulder dot. I added a shoulder dot to my pattern. And once it's done, I remove my pin and that leaves a mark, which I mark with my pen, and then I connect the dot legs to that point. I like to find the middle point of my dots, mostly because I you do not bring your dot all the way to the bust point. You do have to sew your dot to about 5/8 or an inch from the bust point in order to avoid a pointy bust. But I usually do 5/8. And even for this pattern piece, I just went all the way through. But that's the reason why I like to find my middle lines. And I think it looks good. So here I'm folding everything just to finish off my dots. And just like that, I've added a shoulder dot to my pattern. Hopefully that was easy to understand. Next, I'm adding a bust dot on top of my waist dot. So I'm closing my waist dot halfway to bring the other half to my bust. And I did the same thing, trace around the center front and to the point where I want my dot to start at the waist and at the bust as well. I'm using my bust line pretty much as that marking point for where I want my dot to start. And I close my waist dot halfway, so I use the other half at my bust. I pivot it around. And then I just trace around the pattern to my bust line, which gives me the closing dot leg. I mark my point again where my pin was, and then just connect my dot legs to that point. And then I'm going to find my middle, the midpoint of my dots. And that is it for adding a bust dot to my pattern. Next, what I'm doing now is putting a piece of paper behind the little hole that my pin punched because it was getting a bit too large or just too loose. So that helped to keep it tight, the tape piece. So here I am adding a full bust dot, closing my waist dot to turn it into a bust dot. And that is the first time I'm ever doing this. I hardly ever go for a bust dot because I do feel like that's for people with a larger bust. Mine is more modest, so I usually stick to my waist dot, and at most adding a shoulder dot. That's usually the way I go. So I am marking my dot leg point, and because I'm moving the full dot to the bust, so I am closing the dot at my waist. And then I'm going to trace around to my point, which is my bust line that I'm using as my point where I want my dot to be, to open and close. And wherever it reaches, that's where the leg closes. And I remove my pin. I am marking that down with my pin where it left a mark, and then I'm closing. I'm connecting my dot legs to that point. And I'm doing the same thing I've been doing, which is finding the midpoint of my dot. That helps to figure out where to more accurately figure out where to sew your dot to, which will be about 5/8 to 1 inch from the dot point in order to avoid a pointy bust. And I am marking that on my midline. Another way is to measure that with a compass and then draw a circle from the bust point with that measurement that you choose, whether it is 5/8 or 1 inch. And if you are doing multiple dots, then you don't have to measure the midpoint of each dot. The outline of the circle will be the point to which you draw your dot up to. And I went ahead and did that for my other pattern piece where I had the bust dot art. You really should do it for all your pattern pieces, but I only did it for the ones where I had a bust dot. And just like that, all my pieces are done that I wanted to create. Then I went ahead and used pillowcases to create my samples for each of my pattern pieces that I created. And yeah, I cut my pillowcases open and then fold them in half for my front and pin around the whole pattern piece. And then yeah, that's how I keep my fabric in place. Instead of using pattern weights, I just use my pins to pin them to my fabric before I cut. And for my dot, I'm just spinning the legs and the dot point because those are the points that I'll be marking to transfer my dot onto my fabric. I might have mentioned this before in previous videos, but I absolutely love my scissors. They are so sharp, just so smooth. I got them from Amazon for I think 12 bucks. They were on sale. And even then the regular price is still under 20 bucks. For the quality of scissor, I think it's definitely worth it. I am snipping my dot legs here so that I can see from the front and back. And then I use the disappearing ink pen to mark my dot point or bust point. And I did mark the point from the wrong side and right side of the fabric, but it's up to you whether you want to do it on the wrong side or right side. I think you should be doing it on the wrong side. But anyways, I went around and removed all my pins except for the dot point because I will need that to mark my point on the other side of the fabric. For the dot legs, I have my markings from having snipped them with my scissors. So that's there. And I just need to mark my dot point or bust point. Using the disappearing ink to mark my dot was not the best idea because it disappeared way too fast. So I did end up having to use my dressmaking pencil to keep that line as I prepared my dot. I threaded a needle and I went around trying to base stitch my dot before sewing. That's usually what I do when I am hand sewing. I enjoy doing it that way, but it is a longer way to prepare your dot for sewing or basting them. So stick around to see the other way that I do it. But my ink was disappearing way too fast. The disappearing ink pen was doing its job way too well. So I ended up having to use a dressmaking pencil to retrace my lines, my dots, before I could go and base stitch my dot. And of course, I'm working on the wrong side of the fabric. So my base stitching that I'm doing here on the right side everything looks parallel. And this is how everything is looking on this side, just really long stitches. That's what you're gonna see. And that's what everything is looking like at the end. I clearly messed up on the right side because everything was supposed to look parallel and you could see some crisscross. And then I just pull on both ends of my thread, and that's how I create my basting stitch for my dot. That's how I base my dot, this stitch my dot. And yeah, that's what things are looking like. So for the next method, what I do is pinch my dot point and my dot legs to get everything straight. That's the reason why I'm doing that. And then I pin at the dot point and then pin the dot legs. That's just to make sure my dot is straight, not one side is not longer than the other. And then once I'm done pinning the dot legs together, I press the edge or the fold, that is the midpoint of my dot. I press that to create a crease, and with pressing it, I do it little by little from the dot point all the way to the leg dot to keep everything aligned. And once I have that crease line from pressing it, then everything is aligned and I go ahead and start pinning, and my pin should be touching that line, that dot leg on the other side. Maybe I did over explain, but hopefully I did explain everything well enough. I would imagine that most people are probably doing things this way anyways. If not, then this is here. But when I first started to sew, I remember I despised sewing dots. I avoided dots because I could not find any simple way of sewing dots or transferring dots to fabric. But sewing requires patience. You just have to determine that you are going to sew, and you take the time, you follow the steps that you need to follow and get the results that you desire. And so this is the simplest way I've found for me to sew dots, and it still requires patience for you to sit down and just do it right. But I do like doing dots that way. And I went ahead and did the same thing. I did the same thing for all of my other pattern pieces and transferred my dots as well, and base stitched them. Well, not base stitch, just paste them with my pins. And I'm sure it's obvious by now that I do not use seam allowances. I do not add seam allowances to my pattern pieces. I just freehand them with my pattern. I just like having my pattern pieces and be able to manipulate them however I want to manipulate them. And I feel like having my seam allowance in that, it just, it's not the same thing. So I don't add my seam allowance to my pattern pieces. I just freehand them or eyeball them. And I'm using a different dressmaking pencil that is a washout one. The other one is also a washout pencil, so it washes out when you wash the fabric. I do have quite a bit of different marking tools. I do like collecting sewing tools. I think it's cool, but no worries. I've not been to the store for a long time, so I've not been overspending, and I've been getting a lot of stuff for free as well. So that's been great from friends, not sponsors. I did wish I used my owl to demonstrate how to mark the dot points, but I was not thinking at the time, so I did not use that. But I wanted to show all of my tools that I showed from my tools video and how to use them. Eventually, I'll find a reason to show you how I use it because I mainly use it for pockets and other designs, not necessarily dots, but I know other people use it for dots. But I'm doing that same dot method again, the basting method again, by creating the crease line with pressing on the edge, and then I'm pinning and making sure my pin touches the other line and all of it goes straight along the dot legs. I think with the first method that I show, I think that is useful for more slippery fabrics because it won't be easy to get a crease line on certain fabrics. So that's why I showed both methods. I wanted to show this one because it did have the two dots close to each other. Here are all my pieces basted and ready for me to sew my dots. And I'm starting with the first one that I showed you. All I do is sew straight along that line, that this stitch line that I created. All right, so I get all the way to the dot point, and I did miss like 1/8 of the dot, but that's okay. What I do is I tie a knot 3 times. That's what I've always learned. I learned to do that from Reader's Digest. That's a book that has taught me a lot when it comes to sewing. But yeah, that's how I've always tied my dots. I think that's a book I learned it from, but that's what I've always learned to do when it comes to sewing dots. So all the way to the dot point from the dot legs, and then when you get to the dot point, you tie a knot 3 times. I don't know why 3 times, but that works. One day I'll show you how to also do dots with hand sewing because I do it differently. And of course, you have only one strand of thread when you are hand sewing, so that is different. I do it the same way as well when I am doing a fisheye dot. I start from the dot legs, the largest point, and that's just what I did as well with my shoulder dot. I started it from the shoulder to the dot point and from the waist to the dot point. And this is after I sewed that. Once I had all my dots stitched, I then put my side seams together, pin them together, and then pin my shoulder seams together for all of my pieces, and then ready to sew everything together. And then after I sewed my side seams and my shoulder seams, I then added my zipper, which I did not show. The rest of the video is all about the finished project, so stay tuned. And also stay tuned for the next video where I show you how I adjust my armhole. As you can see, my bust point is pointy because I did not leave the 5/8 to 1 inch mark away from the bust point. I sewed all the way to the bust point. I don't have that issue with the back. That's because my dot is actually more narrow at the back and tapered, so that was avoided. And for some reason, my waist ended up being larger than what it is with my regular pattern. I have no idea what was going on apart from the fact that tracing around my pattern piece with the outline having been a marker caused some sort of addition to my measurement, but that is quite a bit. Maybe I don't need the 1 inch ease around my waist, but that did work out well for my first bodice tryout. So I'm not really sure what's going on with that, but my waist did end up being larger than it should be.